Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite aspect of ufology, and that is of course humanoid encounters. I find these not only endlessly fascinating, but I think these are the cases that lie at the very heart of the UFO phenomenon. These are the cases that teach us the most. These are the cases that offer the most insight into who these guys are and why they are visiting our planet. And I've chosen 10 cases from all over the world. The title of this episode is 10 Extreme Extraterrestrial Encounters. And I call it extreme because these are very close encounters. Pretty much all of them have some pretty significant interaction with the witnesses. These cases, again, come from all over the world, including England, France, Finland, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, a couple from South America, including Brazil and Peru, and a couple from the United States, including Iowa and Maine. These also occur over a fairly long period of time, back to 1954 and all the way up to 1985. All different types of humanoids as well, and quite a bit of evidence. A good number of these cases are multiple witnesses, but they're also supported by such evidence as landing traces, animal reactions, physiological effects, and more. So I think you'll find this a pretty compelling episode with a lot of interesting cases that you probably haven't heard before. And the first case I'd like to talk about today, I call the disappointed alien. This is a really unusual case which occurred on October 18, 1954 in Parravicino, Italy. It's an amazing case involving physiological effects and landing traces and a pretty interesting interaction with a very unusual type of ET. This case took place in the midst of an incredible wave of encounters that was centered mostly in France, but also spread to Italy and surrounding areas. On the evening of October 18, 1954, several people in Gel, France reported seeing a UFO landed in a field. But it was in Parravicino in Italy where an encounter occurred that would garner international headlines. In fact, researcher Flavio Vanetti calls it, quote, one of the most authentic in Italian casuistry. Now the sole witness was 37-year-old Renzo Pugina. On the evening of October 18, 1954, he had gone to see a movie and was driving back to his home in Parravicino, again in northern Italy. He had just reached his home when he saw this strange light in a dark avenue which was surrounded on both sides by two walls. He was slightly puzzled, but he didn't pay too much attention to it, kind of dismissed it as perhaps moonlight. So he parked his car in his garage, got out of his car, and began to walk up the stairs to his home, his keys still in his hand. And this is when he was confronted by a sight that would change his life forever. He saw a strange entity, 3, maybe 4 feet tall, glowing with light. He saw instantly that this was not human, and as he later told reporters, he couldn't have been anything but a Martian. So remember, this is well before we went to the moon or had any idea about life in outer space. Many people assumed that extraterrestrial life would be coming from Mars, and that was kind of where he went to. But he said this figure, its head was encased by a helmet with a transparent face mask. He could see through this mask. He saw a human-looking face with roughly Asian features, he said. He said it was surprising because there was no apparent forehead that he could see. This figure did have an olive complexion, and per Renzo looked, quote, as if it had been splashed with car motor oil. The upper half of its body, from the waist upwards, was covered by a glowing metallic, skin-tight jumpsuit with kind of silvery scales. But the lower part, and this is strange, where the legs would be, there was some kind of conical device. He didn't see any legs. The very bottom of this cone, where the point of the cone was attached to a thin tube. Renzo estimates it was about 4 or 5 feet long, and the other end was attached to a small disc-like device, which Renzo says was, quote, as big as a bicycle wheel. So the being and this disc floated a few feet above the ground next to a tree. The entity's left side at this point was facing Renzo. So he was shocked by this sight, but also curious, so he walked towards it to get a better look. And within a few seconds, the being's upper torso rotated towards him, and he set a kind of robotic motion. Its head and face followed in a slightly slower way, but Renzo could now see that this figure was holding what looked like a sort of flashlight-like device in its right hand. This device was glowing faintly with a light on one end. Renzo wondered if it might be a gun of some kind, but the entity immediately pointed this device at Renzo, sending out some kind of energy beam of some kind. It's not clear whether this was a visible light beam or not, but in any case, Renzo became immediately immobilized, paralyzed. As he says, "At this moment, I was left stiff and ground struck, unable to move. I got scared and gripped hard my keys to the garage." So he remained rooted to the spot, unable to move for just a few moments, but with great effort he was able to move his fingers, close his fist around his keys, and with further effort was able to partially break free of this paralysis. As he says, the contact with the metal of his keys neutralized in part the fluid or energy to which I was being submitted, and felt myself free from it. Then I went towards the strange creature, screaming. So he now had some anger at this being for shooting this beam at him. He managed to take a few additional steps towards it, but per Renzo, this being stared at him with an expression of disappointment or annoyance. That's what it looked like to him. He shouted out at it, "Mars." According to some sources, this being grunted in response. This is not clear. At any rate, Renzo took another step, and this is when the being began to move, floating upwards a few feet from the ground, moving alongside of the road. Renzo followed. He says he could hear a faint humming noise coming from this being. This being disappeared around a corner in the road, and Renzo, now completely free of his paralysis, ran after it, but it was gone. Nevertheless, as you might imagine, he was thoroughly traumatized. He rushed back into his house, woke up his wife, who had been asleep. She said that he was so shocked he was unable to even speak. In fact, he lay down in bed and trembled and shook convulsively for the entire night. He remained largely bedridden, in fact, for the next 2 days, feeling shocked and feverish. So this really had a profound effect on him. The press heard about his encounter, and he was interviewed not only by journalists but by the Italian police. And an investigation showed that his gravel driveway had evidence of a mysterious, odorless, dry, dark-colored, oily substance. It wasn't oil, they don't know what it was. Over the next few days it increased in size. Apparently no samples were taken, nor was it ever analyzed. Nevertheless, after speaking with Renzo, the police were entirely convinced of the truth of his testimony. They described him as a normal man with no history of drinking or mental illness. Such an amazing case, and really not an isolated event, because again, this was during that huge wave of encounters, mostly in France, but really in the surrounding areas as well. So that's just the tip of the iceberg with that one. There were hundreds upon hundreds of very similar cases. Can only imagine what it must be like to be that close to an ET. So I certainly understand the witness having a pretty profound reaction to his experience. Now let's move to another case, which did get a lot of publicity and attention, but really is not that well known. I call this one the Martian Stone. This one occurred on November 17, 1954, near Madrid in Spain, and is in fact one of the earliest humanoid encounters reported in this country. It's a really interesting case involving an apparent ET artifact and a quite extensive interaction with the witness and the humanoid. I think you'll find it a pretty compelling case. The witness in this next case was employed as a nurse. His name is Alberto San Martin Gomez, age 37, and he was employed at this time as an assistant at the Las Flores Sanatorium in Madrid, Spain. It was around midnight on the evening of November 17, 1954. Albert was suffering from a toothache, and he often used this method to help relieve his pain, take his mind off of his toothache. He would take a walk. So that's what he would decided to do. He was taking a walk through the streets, which at this time of night were largely deserted. And he was walking near the area around the Ciudad Universitaria, and he had decided to return when he noticed a strange figure standing motionless next to the railing of the Puente Los Franceses bridge. Now he immediately noticed several things that were just a little bit off. This figure's clothes were not normal. This immediately caught Alberto's attention. This figure was dressed in a weird sort of uniform, as Alberto says, like the overalls used by aviators, dark gray, one piece, and without openings. So he was curious. He took a closer look and saw that this figure was in fact a very unusual looking gentleman, just over 5 feet tall, but had very fine features, very pale skin, and unusually white straight hair. As Alberto says, quote, combed like a page boy. You can see a sketch of the figure here. This man was smiling at him, and he seemed almost, quote, angelic in nature and had an aura, Alberto says, of, quote, peace and goodness. In fact, the expression on his face was one that, quote, radiated kindness, serenity, and firmness. So although he was somewhat frightened, Alberto felt himself curiously compelled to approach this man and somewhat comforted by his appearance. But he almost felt like it was almost against his own will. And within moments, he stood directly in front of this unusual man. The man gestured at Alberto, giving him the impression or the message that he was not from Earth, but from another world. At this point, the man suddenly turned quickly, slid down the embankment next to this bridge, and walked up to this small, dark object, which was parked under the bridge. Alberto could see it was about 9 feet wide, and looking at it, he saw it was a metallic disc-shaped craft of some kind. After just a few moments, the man returned, climbing easily back up this embankment, and approached Alberto again, who still stood there, speechless with shock. And, to Alberto's amazement, the man extended his hand and gave him an object, a small rectangular stone of some kind, about 5 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches wide, and inscribed on the surface were 9 curious symbols, either engraved or embedded onto it. This rock had a porous surface, was kind of pinkish in color, somewhat similar to pumice in appearance. Now, without saying a word, the man seemed to wave goodbye to Alberto and immediately returned to his craft under the bridge, and moments later this craft took off diagonally at very high speed and disappeared off into the distance. Now, according to one source, much of this experience was at first shrouded in amnesia, only to be remembered later. Alberto recalled leaving for a walk and then finding himself in a parking lot with the stone in his hand. Though this is not entirely clear when he recalled this, if it was immediate or if it was afterwards. At any rate, he did recall it, and amazed by his encounter, just a few months afterwards, he decided to go public. He contacted the well-known news reporter, Arcadio Vaquero, who ended up publishing Alberto's account in the newspaper and actually obtained the, quote, Martian stone, as it came to be called, so it could be submitted for scientific analysis. And it was. This artifact was taken to the Mineralogy Institute at Madrid to be studied by Professor Pedro Bayon Garcia Campomenes. You can see him here, who determined that the stone was somewhat similar to potassium permanganate. The manganese atom has +7 oxidation state, an ion with a tetrahedral structure that is a strong oxidization agent and is widely used, in fact, in the medical field for cleaning wounds, disinfecting. It's sometimes used for treating dermatitis. But it wasn't as simple as that, because according to the professor, the stone had some strange properties that he couldn't quite explain. Parts of it were soluble and other parts weren't. It did appear to be salty in nature, but did not appear to have any actual salt in it. So there was a bit of an enigma here, and some contradictions as to what exactly this thing was composed of. And then, of course, there were the strange symbols on its surface. The stone was then given to Professor Don Joaquin Maria de Nevescu of the Madrid Archaeological Museum, who attempted to decipher these symbols, but he said he was unable to translate any of these symbols except for one, which he thought might be a representation of the planet Saturn. In fact, as the professor said, there are signs that remind us of the Greeks and the Egyptians, but many of them are unknown. The clearest is the one that represents the planet Saturn in geometric form, the one with the sphere crossed by an oblique line. There is another with 3 lines that resembles the representation of water in ancient Egypt. Another could be identified in Greek culture as the one that symbolizes the boat of Charon, the one that transported the dead. So this really became an enigma. This stone became the subject of many years of study by many people. And later, in fact, one researcher claimed to have translated it to the following message. According to this researcher, the message from these symbols is this: "We come from the high celestial spheres towards your divided world. Soon the arc of heaven will unite with the earthly light. But to avoid the clash, there will be a period of preliminary contacts. The union will be happy. You will lean on us and your cross will be less heavy to bear. You will overcome your evil inclinations when we all shelter under the same roof, and you will finally know peace." So I don't know about that translation. This is one person's translation. But at any rate, following the analysis of this alleged ET artifact, Alberto got it back from the researchers, and his story disappeared from the public for some years. Just a few years later, in 1956, Alberto moved to Brazil and ended up writing a book about his experience called Ambassador of the Stars. And in this book, he shared his story. He had this, quote, Martian stone analyzed again, and this new analysis revealed that the stone was composed of several elements, including corundum, calcite, dehydrated magnesite, aluminum carbonate, calcium silicate, and silver, and other trace elements. At any rate, whatever this object was composed of, it was Alberto's case that helped prompt the founding of Spain's first ufological study group called Friends of Visitors from Space. So in that regard alone, it's an important case. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to read the full-length book written on this case, but it certainly sounds quite interesting. I do wonder about this artifact. It does appear to be unusual. No one's ever proven this case to be a hoax or anything but what the witness actually experienced. I do wonder about the translation of these symbols. It's a really unusual and fascinating case all around that I think does deserve to be more well known. Now let's move to the next case, which is again hardly publicized at all. I don't think a lot of people know about this one. I call this one the alien frogmen. It's an unusual case for sure, but it does involve multiple witnesses, very close-up observation of a UFO and humanoids. This occurred at some point in 1956. The exact date isn't known, but it was in Avely in the United Kingdom, and really a very interesting case. This case comes from researcher Norman Oliver and was first published in the January-February issue of the Bufora Journal. The witness is known only as Mr. E. Venables, so we know his last name but not his first. He was 13 years old and was living at the time in his family's home on Usk Road in Avely, which you can see here, Avely in the UK. This is just a short little road, maybe 1 block long. And it was shortly after midnight one evening in 1956 when the 13-year-old witness was awakened by an orange-yellow light reflecting onto the corner ceiling of his bedroom. Now this window looked out over a plowed field behind his home, so the witness assumed there must be a fire. He got out of bed, stood up on a stool, and looked out the window, and to his amazement, only about 300 feet away, 90 meters or so, he saw a dark craft of some kind sitting on or right above the ground. He said this craft had rotating multicolored lights around the base, and on the top it had an extremely bright orange-yellow light. And it was this light that was illuminating his bedroom. This light was revolving, kind of like a police siren light, he said. Below it there was another bank of lights which were rotating in the opposite direction, and the base of the object was encircled by what looked to him like orange flames coming out of it, coming out of sort of a flange-like base. And these flames were curling and bending downwards to the ground and sort of became more blue in color. But because of these bright lights, it was hard for the witness to discern the exact shape of this object, but he could kind of make out a hemisphere on top, a rim around the edge, which gave the whole thing an appearance very similar to a classic flying saucer, he said. But even more amazing, just beneath the row of orange lights, the witness could see a line of oval-shaped windows. And behind these windows he could see, quote, people in frogmen's suits. Their silhouettes were clearly illuminated, he said, by an intense yellow glow coming from the interior of the craft. He counted 3 or 4 of them as they were walking around inside the craft, apparently busy doing something, as he said, quote, going about their business. He could see that one of them was holding a strange instrument which appeared to be of, quote, considerable size. Now, although the witness could not see their features or how tall they were, he said they looked human-like, except that they had little or no hair. Also very strange was that the craft was completely silent. So staring at this amazing scene, the witness became unnerved when he suddenly noticed a, quote, dark form, which was watching all of this from the backyard. Curiosity overcoming his caution, the witness opened his bedroom window, which of course made a noise, and as if in response, the object rose upwards very quickly, moved off to the north at such high speed it appeared only as a silver line, a blur, and at that same moment the dark figure in his garden disappeared. So this whole experience lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes. But interestingly, it was later that same exact evening, in the wee morning hours, that the witness's mother went into the living room and, looking out the window, noticed a strange red orb approaching the house. She said immediately this looked strange. It moved closer and closer, getting larger and larger quite quickly until it appeared that it might actually hit the house. So she became frightened, ran from the window to get her husband, and when they returned to the window, nothing strange was visible. It was gone. I will admit that case is largely anecdotal, but it's super interesting because it wasn't only the 13-year-old boy who saw something strange that night. Both his parents also confirmed the incident to some degree. So it's a multiple witness case, and that always raises the level of credibility to a case. And it's certainly a fascinating one. Can only imagine what that UFO was doing in their backyard there. But a lot of cases like it. It's easy to dismiss one case or 10. Hey, even 100 you could dismiss. But the fact is there are thousands upon thousands of these cases. I've covered many of them here on this channel, and there's still many, many more. We're still going strong, lots of cases to cover, but here is another. I call this one, I Saw a Man. This is a direct quote from the witness to this case, who is admittedly a young child, but this case does involve landing trace evidence, and there are other corroborating details to it in terms of other sightings in the area. But this one took place on April 23rd in 1966 in Bingham, Maine, and it's an all-around super interesting case because of what this witness described, the humanoid she saw, the interaction she had with this humanoid, and other details that make it interesting. Not only the landing traces, but there were also animal reactions as well. This amazing case comes from researcher Richard Bonifant. You can see him here. He published an article on this case in the Flying Saucer Review. The primary witness is Kimberly Baker, who at the time was 6 years old. You can see her here. She and her two cousins, Wendy and Bruce Higgins, were outside in a large field south of the Higgins house located in Bingham, Maine. Tiny little town. They were out there picking pussy willows, and they found a patch, but discovered that the stems of these plants were too hardy to pick easily. So Wendy and Bruce went to their house to get a pair of scissors, leaving Kimberly alone. Now she was waiting for her cousins to return, and this is when she saw a large, shiny, saucer-shaped object come from the direction of the Kennebec Mill, not too far away, and land less than 100 feet from where she stood. She said it was completely silent. It was so unusual she was startled and frightened, and she froze in place and watched for a full minute as the object just sat there doing nothing. She said it was shiny silver like a toaster. She said there was the outline of a door and a rectangular window about 8 inches high. The craft had 3 lights on it, 2 steady red lights on either side and a flashing green light on top. And looking at the window, Kim was amazed to see a human-looking man inside the craft. And as she watched, she said he seemed to stand up, and she saw that he was dressed in a shiny white uniform of some kind, which had what looked like to her, quote, lots of black buttons on his chest. She said he wore a transparent, quote, bubble helmet on his head, but seeing Kim, he took off his helmet, and as Kim says, he winked at me and smiled. Now, when later asked by researchers if she was afraid, she replied, at first I was, but not after he smiled at me. He said something to me. I don't know what it was. I only saw his lips move. So she couldn't hear him, but apparently he was trying to communicate with her, and she continued to watch. At this point she did notice that the neighbor's husky dog was watching the craft, barking at it. After about 1 minute, this craft took off, moved over the roof of a neighbor's house, and was gone. So alarmed, she went home, crossed the main highway dividing the town alone. This was something she normally did not do. And she went to her mother saying persistently, Mommy, Mommy, I saw something. Now her mother, Joyce Baker, was distracted because she had just recently received the tragic news that an old school friend of hers had passed away. But she did notice that her daughter kept unusually close to her all that day, as if wanting the security of her presence. And it wasn't until 2 days after the incident that Kim's mother, Joyce, got the full story from her daughter, and hearing it, it caused her some concern. She and a family friend, Mr. Allie King, accompanied Kim to the landing site, and they were amazed to see a 15-foot diameter circle of compressed vegetation, including some of the pussy willows that Kim and her cousins were hoping to pick. They did also speak with the neighbor who owned the dog that Kim had seen barking at the object, and the neighbor confirmed that in fact her dog had been barking on that Saturday afternoon at the time of Kim's sighting. The neighbor had not investigated to find out what was upsetting her dog. So although Kim was quite young, her mother said that she was not, quote, the imaginative type, and Mr. King made several attempts to trip Kim up in her testimony by inserting false information, at which point Kim would always correct him and repeat the details of her sighting again. Now, when researcher Richard Bonifant investigated the case, he looked for any outstanding features in this town that might have attracted the UFO. Bingham, at that time, and still is, a very small town, situated along the Kennebec River. But, according to Richard, he did note that the Wyman Dam and Reservoir is located only about 2.5 miles north of the landing site. This is an important geological feature. This installation actually provides electricity to the town of Bingham and several other towns situated along the Kennebec River. And also of interest is that Richard writes that, quote, UFOs have been frequently reported over Wyman Lake, the reservoir that is formed by the Wyman Dam. That certainly could be a factor because there are quite a few cases of UFOs hovering over hydroelectric stations. I do wonder about these many cases of people seeing UFOs dropping down out of the sky, landing right next to them, ETs looking out at them or coming out of the craft in some of these cases. They do sound to me very deliberate, intentional, like the ETs are showing themselves on purpose. Because it doesn't appear that in that particular case, the ETs were coming out of the craft or doing anything there. It looks like they just came down to show themselves to the witness. I wish I could follow up on this case and talk to the witness today to see if she had any other additional encounters, but could be a one-off. That's not unusual. I don't know, but a really compelling case. And there's always another. Here's another super interesting case with some really unusual details to it. I call this one, "A Human-Like Being Was Watching Me." This occurred on March 25, 1972, near the Lutersheide in the Netherlands. This is actually a military area, which is, I think, significant to this case. But judging from the witness's description, it doesn't sound like a reverse engineered craft or human beings piloting it. You can certainly make up your own minds about it, but yeah, some very unusual details to this one. This next case was published in the November-December 1972 issue of the Flying Saucer Review, only about 6 months after it occurred. The main witness is a businessman known only as Mr. B. He did allow his picture to be taken here. This case took place in the Netherlands in an area known as the Lutersheide. This is near the city of Soesterberg. It was around 3:30 a.m., March 25, 1972, when Mr. B was awakened by a loud humming sound coming into his home. Now, he briefly considered that perhaps his own stereo might be the cause, but when he checked it, it was switched off. So he got up to investigate, and this is when he noticed light coming from the window at the front of his house. And looking outside, he saw a very strange blazing light hovering right near his car, right in front of it. This light was surrounded by a wall of what looked like fog, maybe 12 feet long, 6 feet high. So he quickly put on a jacket, a pair of slippers, grabbed his car keys, and rushed out of the house to see if his car was all right. He did notice that all the cars except his, which was wet, all the others were covered with frost. So something had melted the frost on his car. He quickly got into his car and started the engine, and this is when he noticed this weird light or fog seemed to surround him. In fact, he felt the car bounce, he said, as if someone outside had jumped onto it. Seeing the light concentrating around the back of his car, he thought now that perhaps his car was on fire. He admits he wasn't thinking completely clearly at this point, but as he says, it was strange and frightening. In my rearview mirror, I saw the light or fire phenomena at the back of my car, and I thought that my car was on fire. I panicked and accelerated. I drove out of the street. Panic seized me. I was terrified. But things soon became even more strange, because Mr. B felt almost as if he was compelled to drive, and in fact drove for about 7 miles in somewhat of a daze. At one point, as he's driving down the road, he came upon this chain blocking the way and was amazed to see it suddenly rise up, seemingly by itself, become taut, and then suddenly snap. So he stopped the car, and he realized that he was now at the Lutersheide military range, where, as he says, normally no people come here. And this is when he saw a, quote, human-like figure run past me. As Mr. B says, it had come from somewhere behind my car and seemed to be on its way to a certain point right in front of me. Suddenly it vanished. I got out and now distinctly saw an enormous object in front of me, around which was a greenish glow. To the left of me, I saw an oval-shaped bright light which was moving among some trees towards the object in front of me. So Mr. B was now about 30 to 40 feet from this large object, which he says was lens-shaped. And again, I'll just let him describe what happened next. As Mr. B says, it had some sort of windows from which issued the greenish light. It was a peculiar, diffuse glow. I also noticed that the object had a metallic appearance, like aluminum. I did not see any welds or rivets. The windows formed an integral part of the surface. There were no window frames or the like. On top of the object were three thick green beams of fluorescent-like light, like those of searchlights, shining upwards into the sky. Behind one of the windows, I saw a strange, human-like being who was looking at the greenish light phenomena and who seemed to perform certain actions. So this object was hovering just above the ground. Mr. B was both curious and afraid. He wondered if the figure he had seen run by his car was the one who was now in the object, as the figure had in fact run in that direction. But Mr. B's curiosity overcame his fear, and he began to walk towards the craft. Mr. B estimates that this object was about 120 feet long and maybe 12 feet high. And as he says, when I came closer, there appeared right in front of me, behind the window, a human-like being that was watching me. It made a gesture with its right hand, which seemed to indicate back, back. At the time, I was at a distance of some 3 or 4 meters from the object, and I looked into it. The being, which I could see and describe very clearly, seemed to be counting the fingers of its left hand. The being or creature was 5 feet and 5 inches. It was dressed in sort of a tight-fitting overalls of a peculiar material with a dull metallic glow. This clothing had no seams, and it fitted tightly around the wrists. Around its waist, it was wearing what seemed to be a belt at the right side, of which emerged some sort of tube running upwards behind its back, and was attached at the side of its head to a stand-up collar. Its head was oval-shaped, with slightly disproportionate almond-shaped eyes. The eyes seemed to look right through you. So this figure appeared to be smiling, and behind it Mr. B did see an instrument panel which was flashing different colored lights. He also noticed other, quote, human-like beings, which were behind the other windows. So shortly after this first figure gestured at Mr. B to move back, the craft jerked quickly upwards. It hovered momentarily, floated 30 feet or so to the right, then it suddenly darted off at very high speed off into the distance, emitting a strange sound. In seconds it was just a grayish spot with a glow around it in the distance. So Mr. B now drove home to find his wife very anxious. She asked him why he had rushed out of the house, leaving the front door wide open, and where had he gone. So he explained to her what happened. Everyone was very puzzled. He later returned to the spot, and they found an area of crushed grass. Mr. B says that at the time he did not believe in UFOs. In fact, he had never given them any thought. But as he says, quote, I must confess to myself that I have seen something very strange which upset me for 2 days afterwards. So a pretty interesting case, and it's not the only one in this area, because on February 17, 1991, a military witness was on watch at this base near Selsterberg in this area when he and another cadet saw a, quote, big circle in the sky straight on top of us. It had no shape, but only bright lights slowly rotating anti-clockwise. The colors were in a liquid manner. You can see the sketch of it here. The witness estimated that this object was anywhere from 90 to 150 feet in diameter, totally silent. It did not appear to be any object he was familiar with, and of course he was familiar with aircraft. As they watched, this object rotated faster and then suddenly shot off at, quote, incredible speed to the west. Both witnesses felt a short, hard downblast of air. This object had moved more than 20 miles in less than a second, he said. According to the witness, this thing covered that distance from stationary in something like 0.10 seconds. I know aviation and have flying experience, and I'm very technical. This kind of extreme acceleration turns humans into liquid. So following this encounter, both witnesses did become quite ill. They suffered from high fever and extreme vomiting. And in fact, as the witness says, the illness was so bad that it left me completely traumatized and not able to speak about it for years. and he kept quiet about it for a very long time until finally coming forward. There you go. Another UFO landing case in humanoids that's really hard to explain as something conventional or prosaic. I was leaning towards this being possibly a reverse engineered craft piloted by humans, but I don't know. His description of the craft being perfectly smooth, having no rivets or seams or anything like this, matches up with genuine UFO accounts, as does his description of the humanoid, wearing a jumpsuit without any seams in it, the very large eyes, the eyes that kind of stare right through you. Some of the other details all point towards this being a genuine extraterrestrial encounter. From just putting out the facts as we know them, you can make up your own minds about it. I think it's an important case. And here's another one which is super interesting. I like this one because it's actually one of a series of events which occurred in this area at that time. I call this one Aliens in Iowa. This occurred on June 6, 1972 in Dayton, Iowa, not Ohio, Iowa. And this is a very small town, a farming town. And this case involves a very close-up landing of a UFO and, of course, humanoids. But yeah, a lot of other landings in this area and some really very compelling landing trace evidence that got a lot of attention from researchers at the time it was occurring. This is an important case, I think. This next case was investigated by APRO researchers, primarily Kevin Randall. It did appear in Saga Magazine's 1973 UFO special issue, in the May-June 1974 issue of the APRO Bulletin, and in Jim and Coral Lorenzen's book, Encounters with UFO Occupants. The main witness at the time was known only as Mr. T, but we now know him to be either Edward Teague or Mervyn Teague. He was 46 years old at the time of his encounter. This was June 6, 1972. On that afternoon, Mr. Teague was working in the fields of his farm when a flash of light in the sky caught his eye. Again, this is in Dayton, Iowa, a tiny little town. So Mr. Teague looked up and saw this silvery craft. Now, he assumed it was just an airplane in the distance and didn't pay too much attention to it. But it was moving towards him, and very fast, fast as a jet, he said. And it definitely got his attention when suddenly it came swooping down right for him. And when it got close to him, it slowed down rapidly and then very slowly came in for a landing in his cornfield. And Mr. Teague could now see that this was a very unusual craft, egg-shaped, about 15 to 20 feet tall. As it set down in his field, 3 landing gear, quote, grew out of the bottom. This object landed only about 300 feet away. The witness could see it was casting a shadow on the ground, so it was solid. And as he watched, a port or a door opened on the lower section, and as the witness says, quote, some people came out and, quote, they messed around in his field. So these beings, he says, were 4, maybe 5 feet tall, and were wearing one-piece metallic, quote, flying suits. As the witness says, a port of some kind opened on the side, near the bottom, and some people got out. They moved around the corn for a while. I don't think they even knew I was there. But they remained there for a while, about 30 minutes, during which time the witness did not attempt to get any closer. He said he could hardly believe what he was seeing, but he did keep his eyes on the ship and the occupants the entire time they were there. After 30 minutes, these beings returned back into their craft, which immediately took off with a, quote, slight roar. Mr. Teague did notice a blue flame come out of the bottom, and the craft very quickly disappeared off into the distance. But looking where the object had landed, this farmer, Mr. Teague, did see that his crops had been flattened. And as it turns out, at the time of this encounter, numerous people in the area had been finding strange circular marks of burned and crushed vegetation in their fields. This is in Story City and Boone, both only about 30 miles from Dayton, and in Goldfield, 40 miles away. One of the more impressive cases was at the farm of Leslie Budd Poling, and in this case, these circles showed not only crushed and burned vegetation, but strange holes, some 22 inches deep, with dehydrated plants on the outside of the circle and strange gray dust in the circle. Some of this dust was collected and analyzed and was showed to be the same soil in the area, only had been exposed to such intense heat that all the organic matter had been burned out of it. There was another family in this area who said that they had seen UFOs so many times. In fact, one of the objects actually shot a beam of light at one of their children. They tried numerous times to take photos. The photos would never come out. They were always blurred or blank. On a few occasions, they said beings did come out, and everyone in the family saw them. As the farmer said, they're about 4 feet tall and wear these one-piece suits, and their eyes look funny. They bend around the sides of their heads. So there was definitely something going on in Dayton, Iowa, and the surrounding areas at the time of this encounter, 1972. Can you imagine standing next to a landed UFO and humanoids for a full half hour? Well, I can't blame the witness for not approaching closer. I wonder how I would have reacted, or how you would have reacted. I mean, it's easy to say, oh, I would have walked up to them and said hi, but I don't know. Once it's happening to you, your reaction might be a little bit different. Very hard to say for sure, but certainly an important series of events, because again, this was not an isolated case. There was apparently quite a few landings going on at that time. And here is another case. It's just amazing. There's case after case after case of these UFO landings and humanoids. This case doesn't involve a landing, but it's certainly a very close-up observation of an unconventional craft with a humanoid looking out of it. I call this one a sensation of being watched. This one occurred on one day in April of 1973 in Gräsleby. This is in Finland. It's not an isolated event. There was quite a few other cases going on in this area. So certainly, while this is a single witness case, there is corroboration to it. But I like this case because some of the details the witness describes are important and are details that we hear again and again in other accounts, such as this sensation of being watched. I think you will find it interesting. Certainly hope so. This next case is quite brief, but certainly interesting, and it comes from researcher Professor Bertil Söderqvist. He's the MUFON representative for Sweden. This case took place in Gräsleby, Finland. It's a very rural area. The witness is anonymous. The exact time or date is not known, but it occurred sometime in April of 1973. The witness was driving his car in the area when he says he saw an unidentified craft not too far from the road. It caught his attention, so he immediately stopped his car and got out to get a better look. And this craft seemed to respond to his presence, as it immediately moved closer, moving in weird, sharp, jerky motions. With each jerky motion, it would move about 30 feet closer, very quickly approaching to about 450 feet away from him and 150 feet above the ground. And it was a classic saucer. According to the witness, it was bowl-shaped, quite large, almost 100 feet in diameter. It was metallic. It had flashing red and green lights on it, illuminated windows or portholes situated around the circumference. The craft itself was surrounded by shimmering heat waves. He also noticed a very unusual and powerful odor. But most interesting of all was that the witness could see moving shadows, presumably the UFO occupants, in the portholes of this craft. He also had, quote, the sensation of being watched. So he watched this craft for a good 10 minutes until it moved off and it was gone. Reportedly, there is more information to this case, but this is all I was able to locate. There have been other dramatic sightings in this area. It was just 3.5 years later, at 4:15 p.m. on November 14, 1976, that 10 people in separate areas all observed a UFO. Two of the witnesses described this object as helmet-shaped, shiny silver, about 20 feet wide. Yellow-red lights came from the lower portion, and what looked like a plume of smoke was coming from the top. They saw no markings or windows on the craft. It quickly moved off, but moments later was seen hovering over a nearby power plant by other witnesses. And in fact, it remained in sight for almost an hour, moving up and down, maneuvering around, sending down a beam of light into the woods below at least 3 times. It was during this time a smaller sausage-shaped craft appeared, situated itself below the larger one. This one was white in the middle, but at the ends was lit up orange, blue, and red. Meanwhile, other witnesses were driving into this same area when they described a glowing object the size of a full moon. There was another farmer about 6 miles away who apparently saw the same thing, as did numerous people in various locations of this same area. At least 2 other groups of witnesses in the surrounding area also reported strange aerial activity at that time. So many witnesses that the local Air Force was contacted, but they had no explanations to offer for all of this strange activity. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. UFOs are being seen everywhere, and of course that includes extraterrestrials. I do think that's what we're dealing with here. That's my personal assessment, but I'm just putting out the facts again as we know them in an objective, unbiased way. You can make up your own minds about all of this activity that's going on here, but I think we can say with fair amount of certainty that something very profound is going on here. Now, here's another case, which I call This Deep Silence Surrounded Us. This occurred on August 22nd, 1975 in Saint-Omer, France. And I like this case because it is a multiple witness case. It's also interesting because of the description by the witnesses of this profound silence that settled down around them during this encounter. Of course, this is popularly known as the Oz effect. It's fairly commonly reported. This is a good example of it. It's one of the reasons I wanted to include this case. But yeah, another very interesting case of a very close-up encounter with a UFO and humanoids. This case was investigated by Joel Maynard and Jean-Marie Bijorn and was published in the French magazine Lumière dans la nuit. That means lights in the night. It was 11:30 p.m., August 22nd, 1975, as 2 young men, they were aged 17 and 20, both students, they have requested anonymity. They were making a bulk newspaper delivery between Boulogne and Lille in France. They were able to earn a commission based on their newspaper deliveries. So they were driving their motorcycles when they found themselves being briefly followed by what they first assumed was a car. But it was following very closely behind them, a mere 15 feet, they said, but suddenly it disappeared, which absolutely astonished them as there was nowhere for this car to disappear to. But not thinking much about it, they continued their journey, and it was only moments later, after a turn in the road, that they saw something glowing in the field to their left, about 600 to 900 feet away. They said it was very bright, it looked very unusual, so they both stopped their motorbikes to get a better look. And what they saw amazed them. This was a craft. They said it was egg-shaped, completely smooth, no windows, no landing legs, no protuberances of any kind. It was pretty small. It was about 12 feet long, 4.5 feet high, and it was glowing with white-yellow light. On the rear section they could see a blinking light, but standing next to it on the right side were 2 glowing humanoid figures, standing about 10 feet away from this craft. They said these figures were of normal human height and looked human as far as they could tell, but due to the brightness of the light they could really only see their silhouettes. But both men did notice something else odd, a profound silence which had settled down upon them. As one of the witnesses said, "I had the feeling of being isolated from the rest of the world in this deep silence that surrounded us." What was even more strange was the way these figures were moving. They seemed to stagger in a strange way, but moved with extreme speed. And in fact, almost immediately, these two figures began to move towards the witnesses. As one of the witnesses says, they were moving at a dizzying speed. As you can imagine, this frightened the two young men, who quickly got on their motorcycles and drove off at high speed. They had gone just a few miles when suddenly, through the rear view mirrors, they saw this craft taking off at an angle and disappearing off into the distance in mere seconds. They were so frightened by this encounter that neither of them was able to recall the exact place that they had seen this craft land. But there was one other odd detail that really puzzled both of them. This craft was so small it didn't even look like it could fit the two humanoids that they had seen standing next to it. Amazing, right? And here's another case of a very small UFO that looks too small for the ETs to even fit inside. But as we know from the many reports of people who've been taken on board craft, the interior of the UFO is often, or at least sometimes, reported as being quite larger than it appears on the outside. This just goes to show how advanced ETs are. They're able to utilize, I think, time and space, or have a greater understanding of it than certainly we do. So yeah, very, very advanced. I think that's one thing pretty much all researchers agree upon. Whoever these guys are, they're extremely advanced. Now let's move to another case, which is very interesting, undeniable, because there was so much activity going on at this time. I call this one Shocked by a UFO. This witness did have some pretty significant physiological reactions. He had witnesses around him. It was by no means an isolated event because there were other sightings and encounters on that same day, also prior to it and following it. This was on October 12, 1977 in Saint Antonio de Tau, Brazil. A truly important case, I think, that deserves to be more well known. It was 11:30 p.m., again on October 12, 1977, when Manuel Espirito Santo, age 20, was hanging out with four of his friends in front of his house in Sant Antonio de Tau. His other friends were Julio, Paulo, Deca, and Carlito. Their attention was all suddenly drawn to a star-like object moving very quickly across the sky from east to west. As they watched, it changed in color from bright yellow to red, and within just a few moments, it decreased its speed and dropped down, zigzagging slightly and rotating, hovering about 60 feet away from the group of young men. It moved in a very strange fashion, and they could now see that this was, in fact, a strange craft of some kind. It was cylindrical shaped, vertical, much like a barrel. Coming out from the bottom was a smaller cylindrical device which was glowing with bright blue light, though the very bottom of it did have a red light coming out of it. They also noticed a small pipe-like protrusion extruding from the center of the midsection of this craft. Now this craft was solid metallic, except for a large square-shaped window which wrapped around the entire front section of this barrel shape. This window was 3 feet 9 inches wide, they estimate, and about 4.5 feet high. The craft glowed with this yellow-red light, the entire surface of it, except of course for this transparent window section, which seemed to glow with the blue light coming from within it. They could now hear a soft noise coming from this craft, but it was mostly quiet. But the most interesting part, of course, was what was inside this craft, or rather, who. Through this transparent square window, the witnesses could clearly see two short, human-looking figures. On the left side was a man, and on the right a woman. There was a weird dividing section between them. Both these figures wore weird-looking goggles in front of their eyes, some type of headgear. The goggles were different on the man than the woman. But as the five witnesses stared at the craft in wonder, the man inside the left section of the craft raised his hands and appeared to be adjusting his goggles as if to better view the witnesses. But the woman on the right appeared to be working some controls inside the craft, and this caused immediately a glowing beam of red light to come out of the small device affixed to the right midsection of the craft, and it went right down towards the group of witnesses. It was apparently carefully aimed because the beam of light hit Manuel directly. He says he felt a strong jolt like an electric shock, which began with his feet, very quickly moved up to his head, causing his entire body to become rigid and paralyzed. He felt weakness overcome him. He felt his consciousness beginning to waver. He said he felt almost entranced, like he was about to faint. Now this beam remained on him for quite a few moments, and then it retracted and it began to move away. Manuel could now move his arms and legs, but he says that a numbness continued to pervade his body for the next few minutes. So this craft rose slowly upwards, tilted at an angle, straightened up, moved to the right and turned onto its left side, moved up some more, turned completely upside down, and then moved off and away into the distance. It moved, said the witnesses, in a wavy motion, kind of like a leaf in the wind, at various speeds until it reached a certain altitude, and then it just darted away at super high speed. The witnesses were later interviewed by the Brazilian military, who showed great interest in their case. They would later release a report detailing the case, complete with the drawings you see here. And at the time, many people in the area were seeing UFOs, and many of these involved objects that would send down beams of light at the witnesses. Just a few weeks earlier, on September 22nd, 1977, at 9:30 p.m., Raimundo Francisco de Chagas was walking to his home in this same area when he saw a bright yellow light coming down towards him. He became frightened and hid in a grove of palm trees, and he says that this object hovered overhead, sending down blue beams of light in various directions as if looking for him. He said he could hear a hissing noise coming from this object, which finally left, but he says afterwards he felt a numbness in his body which persisted for a few days. On the very same day as Manuel's encounter, some hours earlier at 2 p.m., another gentleman by the name of Manuel Matos de Souza was on the road PA-16 at the 23-kilometer mark when he says he saw an object hovering 60 feet overhead, lighting up everything around it. He actually pointed his gun at it, probably not a good idea because this object immediately struck him with a beam of red light, which he said felt like electricity and rendered him temporarily paralyzed until this object moved off. Again, on the same day, same area, immediately after Manuel's encounter, the first one, a 40-year-old man, also by coincidence named Manuel dos Santos, he was in his home when a beam of light came through the roof, rendered him temporarily paralyzed, and he says he suffered from numbness and soreness for a full week. The next day, October 13, 1977, Doña Alzira was in the backyard of her home in this same area again when a huge light came 60 feet overhead. She ran into her house but was hit by this red beam of light, which again caused this weird numbness. And in fact, for 8 days she said she felt shaky, lethargic, and suffered from a headache. This was the time of the very well-known Colares sightings. In fact, Dr. Waleed Carvalho, who worked at the nearby Colares hospital, treated some of the witnesses who said they were struck by these beams of light. She herself had a sighting of an object hovering overhead, and she drew what she saw. And as you can see, it shows a remarkable similarity to the object that was first seen by Manuel and his 4 friends on October 12, not only in appearance, but in movement. So something was going on in that area at that time. I mean, come on, that's totally undeniable when you have multiple cases occurring on one day and in the time prior and following an incident with so many witnesses and physiological reactions. It's absolutely undeniable that something very profound is going on here. And I wonder about cases like these, with this UFO coming down and just kind of showing itself off in an obvious, intentional, purposeful, deliberate way. It appears very much like this is some sort of publicity campaign where the ETs are coming with an agenda to simply announce their presence. I don't know. I'm just presenting the facts as we know them. You can, again, make up your own minds about it. But it's case after case after case. And here is another one. I really like this case. It's quite positive. It's very extensive and really just a very compelling witness. I find him to be quite sincere and honest. I call this one, "We Have Been Watching You." This is, of course, a direct quote from the ETs involved in this case. This actually involves two major incidents, the first occurring in 1979 when the witness was a young child, and the second occurring on March 15, 1985. Both of these were in Peru, one in Lima, and one in a location in the foothills of the Andes known as Chacra. Really interesting case, this one. The sole witness in this case is Renato Longato. You can see him here. In 1979, he was just a young boy. But even at that age, he had developed a strong interest in UFOs, but was frustrated by it because at that time there were very few publications that featured this subject, especially where he was located in Lima, Peru. He would find himself lying in bed at night, staying awake until 1 or 2 in the morning, just looking out his window and watching the stars, thinking about what was out there. It became such a persistent habit that his mom would have to chastise him, go into his bedroom, and order him to go to sleep. But he kept doing it, and it was one evening in 1979, he had gone to sleep like any other night, but woke up to an amazing sight. As Renato says, "I opened my eyes and I saw my bedroom glowing, illuminated, and the door opened by itself. Once the door opened, I sat down on my bed and I saw this woman wearing a metallic uniform with a white belt. Now, per Renato, she was quite beautiful. She had pale skin, blonde hair, pristine green, almond-shaped eyes, and a tender smile. Renato instantly felt at complete peace with her. He felt like she knew everything about him, like he was an open book to her. She walked up to him, stood very close, placed her right hand on her forehead, and began to speak to him telepathically. And she said, 'What you need to do, Renato, is use your mind.' She repeated the phrase again, 'What you need to do, Renato, is use your mind.' And she stepped even closer. At this point, Renato felt this overwhelming sense of love coming from her. And she repeated this phrase a third time. 'What you need to do, Renato, is use your mind.' At this point, Renato found himself closing his eyes, and the next thing he knew, it was morning. But he knew it was a real experience. This was not a dream. It completely changed his life. As he says, 'Since that day, I was just really desperate to find out information about how to use my mind.' So as a young man, he began to visit various groups and seek out teachers. He tried Maharishi Yogi, the Hare Krishnas. Finally, he heard a lecture from Jose Silva and learned about his method called the Silva Mind Control Method, which is all about psychic development. And sure enough, Renato began having ESP experiences, remote viewing. He started to see images of the Peruvian Andes mountains. They would pervade his mind over and over again. A very specific scene. And he began to have a strong feeling that something was going to happen. He started experiencing a lot of coincidences and synchronicities involving the Peruvian Andes. So he knew there was something to this. Finally, he decided to take action. It was around 11 a.m. on March 15, 1985 that he found himself in a place called Chacra. This is in Chosica, Peru. He immediately recognized this scene once he got there from the visions he had been seeing in his head. So he stayed a while, hoping something would happen. But after a half an hour, waiting for something to happen, nothing did. So he decided to leave. And as soon as he made that decision, this is when his experience began. As Renato says, "I saw in the distance in front of me this glowing arc of energy, a shivering light pulsing, and it became stronger. The wind stopped blowing, the birds stopped singing, the leaves, the branches, everything stopped for a moment. I felt like I was inside a bubble. Time seemed to stand still. In that moment, A human-like being popped out of the light. I was in shock. I almost fainted. Renato realized that this being was not a normal human, and he became absolutely overwhelmed with fear, wondering if he was about to be taken, abducted. Would they be friendly? He says this being was very tall, about 6 feet 3 inches, very athletic, strong, broad shoulders, very long arms, reddish hair, and was wearing a gray, metallic, silver uniform. So this being walked towards Renato, almost seeming to glide or float towards him. Renato started to tremble and shake in fear, but the man raised his left hand and said, "I will not hurt you. Relax." At this point, Renato could feel the man's aura of friendliness, and he immediately calmed down. The man said, "Don't worry. I came here to give you a message." In fact, the man gave Renato a name and said, "This is your name. This is like a mantra for you, your personal mantra." Renato has kept the secret, but this man told him, "We are here to contact you in order to give you this information, this mantra for you. We have been observing you since the day you were born, and we want you to continue what you're doing." So Renato thought to himself, what have I been doing? But he had the impression it was the meditation he had been doing. He had purified his diet, was eating no meat, not smoking or drinking any alcohol. Again, he was training very hard to work on his psychic abilities. So he believes this is what the being was talking about. And this being continued to talk and said, "You have to continue what you're doing. We're going to be in touch with you, and you have to practice with this new name that you have." The being said that he had to practice the pronunciation, and when he finally got it right, Renato would feel this energy coming through his solar plexus. This whole meeting lasted a good 10 minutes, and then this being raised his hand, gave his name, told Renato where he was coming from, and said, "We're going to be in contact with you." He then walked backwards, or floated backwards, became swallowed back into the shimmering light, and disappeared. Instantly, Renato could feel the wind blowing, the birds started chirping again, the water running, and then, as Renato says, "I saw this metallic disc make a 45-degree angle and it disappeared. He saw it rise up from behind a nearby mountain or hill, and it was gone in a mere seconds." But it was the after effects of this experience that affected Renato profoundly. He found it very hard to go on with his day-to-day life. He later became very active in the UFO community, speaking publicly about his experiences, connecting with many major researchers, and in fact wrote some books about UFOs and related subjects. So yeah, you can tell that that witness was very deeply and profoundly affected by his encounters, to the point where this subject really became a big part of his life, and he has lectured all across the world, has met a lot of leading researchers and contactees, and had a profound effect on this field, all stemming from his two major encounters with ETs. It's amazing how many people are having these kinds of experiences. It's not just a few thousand. I think it's probably closer to the millions, and I know there are a lot of researchers who would absolutely concur with that. This is not as rare as a lot of people might think. I think millions upon millions upon millions of people are having these encounters. I've mentioned this before, but J. Allen Hynek was once quoted as saying 1 in 40 people have been on board a UFO. And of course there's the Roper organization, which did a poll in 1991 that found about 1 in 50 people show the markers of being a contactee. So the point is, this is far more common than most people realize. There are a lot of cases. This is important information. I think this is a subject that really has the potential to change the world. I think all of humanity deserves to know that we are not alone in this universe. I can't imagine if we were. To me, that would be far more frightening than not being alone. I'm actually very comforted by these cases. I know some people do have a lot of trauma and fear surrounding their encounters, but I think if you take a good, hard long, deep, objective look at the totality of cases, you'll find it's quite encouraging and really good news for humanity. That's certainly my assessment, but again, I encourage everyone to research this themselves. Do the work. Ask the hard questions. And that's how I'm going to close this episode for today. Thank you again for watching, you guys. I truly appreciate it. These 10 humanoid encounters, again, just the tip of the iceberg, have so much to teach us. So, until next time, again, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for answers. Most important of all, because it's why we're here, keep having fun. Bye for now, and I will see you on the next episode.